I need you to pause for a second because what most people think they know about preventing cancer after 50, it's not the full picture. Your doctor isn't trying to hold anything back. That's not what this is. The reality is, nutrition science takes time to move forward, and a typical appointment just isn't long enough to cover what actually matters here. What changed this for me was seeing how the data actually lined up over time. There was a large study out of Harvard that followed more than 47,000 adults over the age of 50, and it ran for nearly 2 decades. What stood out wasn't subtle. The group that consistently consumed certain plant compounds was associated with a 41% lower incidence of common cancers in that data set. 41% is not noise or chance, it's a pattern strong enough that you don't ignore it. And there's something else I want you to keep in mind as we go through this, because one of the foods on this list, number two, is something you've probably eaten recently, maybe even this week. But the way most people prepare it ends up canceling out most of what makes it useful in the first place. We'll get to that. Before we do, I want to ask you something directly. Drop a comment and tell me your age and whether cancer has affected you or someone close to you. I read through those, every single one. It shapes what I bring into these conversations. What we're about to go through is a countdown, 5 down to 1. These are foods researchers in oncology are actually paying attention to right now. Nothing exotic, nothing expensive, just things sitting in a regular grocery store, usually for a few dollars. Once you see that pattern clearly, the first place it starts to show up is in something as simple as black beans. Black beans sit at the bottom of this list, but they don't behave like something at the bottom. Research coming out of the University of Colorado Cancer Center looked at compounds inside black beans, particularly resistant starch, and a group of polyphenols called anthocyanins, the pigments that give them that deep color. In laboratory models, those compounds have been shown to suppress the growth of colon cancer cells in laboratory models, in some cases by as much as 75%. And the way this happens isn't happening where most people expect. Resistant starch doesn't break down in your small intestine the way regular carbohydrates do. It passes through intact and reaches the colon, where your gut bacteria take over. As your gut bacteria ferment it, they produce short-chain fatty acids, including butyrate, which sends signals that can push precancerous cells towards self-destruction before they can develop further. That process becomes more relevant as the body changes over time. The lining of the intestine becomes more permeable, less selective about what stays contained. That shift creates a low-grade inflammatory environment that tends to support cancer development rather than resist it. Black beans move directly into that environment. The fiber feeds bacteria that help reinforce the intestinal barrier, while the anthocyanins act on inflammation at the molecular level. It's not one pathway, it's multiple layers working in the same direction. How you prepare them turns out to matter more than most people expect. When you start with dried beans, soak them overnight, then cook them yourself, you end up with noticeably more of those protective compounds available. The research points to roughly a 30% increase compared to canned beans are still workable, but you handle them a little differently. You drain them, rinse them well, and then when you cook, you add a tablespoon of extra virgin olive oil. That fat changes how your body takes in those polyphenols. In terms of how much, it doesn't need to be complicated. About half a cup, 3 to 4 times a week, lines up with what the data suggests. And I want to give you a real example because this is where it starts to feel tangible. Margaret, 67, a retired school teacher out of Tucson, had watched her mother and her aunt both go through colorectal cancer in their 60s. That history stayed with her. She adjusted her routine, nothing extreme, just consistent, and black beans became something she included 4 times a week. 18 months later, after a follow-up colonoscopy, her gastroenterologist told her the condition of her colon looked closer to someone 10 years younger. She told me she cried right there in the office. This is where most people tend to miss what's actually happening underneath. It's not about a single dramatic change. It's the smaller shifts that hold long enough to actually show up. When that same pattern shifts from fiber-driven effects into fat-based signaling, walnuts start to show a very different response. A small handful, about 2 ounces a day, was enough in a study out of UC Davis working with Marshall University to show changes in gene expression linked to breast cancer metastasis by as much as 58% in higher risk women. That's not subtle. What makes that possible isn't one single compound, it's how several things stack together. There's the omega 3 fat, specifically alpha linolenic acid, which your body can turn into the same anti inflammatory compounds you normally associate with fish oil. This becomes relevant because that low, steady background inflammation is exactly where cancer tends to gain ground. Then there's ellagic acid. That one interferes with how tumors build their own blood supply. Without that network, growth becomes harder to sustain. And alongside that, walnuts carry melatonin, the same molecule people connect with sleep, but one that has shown direct activity against tumor cells in multiple models. Put those together, and you're not looking at one pathway being nudged. You're seeing pressure applied from several directions at once. This tends to matter more as those changes accumulate over time. Natural antioxidant production tends to drop somewhere in the 30 to 40% range, and the mitochondria inside your cells don't hold up the same way they used to. They're more exposed to the kind of oxidative stress that sets damage in motion. Walnuts, in a sense, step into that gap. And the way you use them makes a noticeable difference. Keeping them raw matters. Once you bring high heat into it, those omega 3s start to degrade and the ellagic acid doesn't hold up the same way. There's also an interesting pairing that shows up in the research. When walnuts are eaten alongside a small amount of dark chocolate, 70% cacao or higher, the interaction between those flavonoids and the compounds in the walnuts produces a combined effect that goes beyond what either one does on its own. That was described in work out of the University of Barcelona. In terms of amount, it stays simple. Around 2 ounces a day, a small handful, and timing comes into play as well. The afternoon tends to be when your body's antioxidant activity dips, so placing them there lines up with that natural rhythm. And then something smaller, easy to overlook, starts to carry a surprising amount of weight. Pumpkin shows up here, but not just the flesh. The seeds matter just as much, sometimes more. There was a large data set, over 120,000 participants, where higher intake of carotenoids like beta carotene lined up with about a 28% lower risk of lung cancer. That signal held consistently, but the seeds are where another layer comes in. They carry a lignan called sequoisolera-cyrazinol, which your gut converts into enterolactone. That compound behaves like a phytoestrogen, and in multiple lines of research, it's been linked to slower proliferation in hormone-sensitive cancers, including certain types of breast and prostate cancer. At the same time, something else is happening with age. The immune system doesn't keep the same level of surveillance. There's a gradual shift, what's often referred to as immunosenescence, where those early detections of abnormal cells don't happen as reliably. That's where zinc becomes relevant. Pumpkin seeds are unusually dense in it. About 1 ounce gets you close to 20% of what you need in a day. And zinc plays directly into T cell function, the part of the immune system that's out there identifying and responding to those abnormal cells. So you're seeing a combination here, signals that relate to cell behavior and support for the system that's supposed to catch problems early. How you handle them in practice stays pretty straightforward, but a couple of details make a difference. Keeping the heat lower when you roast the seeds around 300 degrees and limiting it to about 15 minutes helps preserve more of what you're actually trying to keep. From a routine standpoint, about 1 ounce of the seeds each day and then bringing in the pumpkin itself 2 to 3 times a week lines up with what's been observed in the research. There's also a simple pairing that shifts how much of that zinc your body actually takes in. When it's eaten alongside a source of vitamin C, something like a squeeze of lemon or a serving of bell pepper, absorption goes up. So more of it ends up where it needs to go. And there's still something coming up that tends to catch people off guard. It's a food most people already use, but the way it's prepared usually strips out a large part of what makes it useful in the first place. If this has been useful so far, take a second to hit like and subscribe if you haven't. And this is where something most people already eat starts to work very differently depending on one small detail. Broccoli has been studied for years because of a compound called sulforaphane. It's one of the more extensively researched molecules in nutrition when it comes to cancer. What it does is activate a pathway known as NRF2. That pathway controls a set of enzymes your cells use to neutralize compounds that can damage DNA. But the key point here is that sulforaphane isn't actually sitting inside the broccoli waiting for you. What's there instead is a precursor, glucoraphanin, and a separate enzyme called myrosinase. When those two come into contact, that's when sulforaphane is formed. That usually happens when you chew it. The problem shows up with heat. Once you cook broccoli above about 140 degrees Fahrenheit, the myrosinase is largely destroyed. The precursor is still there, but it just passes through without being converted. So you end up eating it thinking you've done something beneficial, but in practice, you're only getting a fraction of what was possible, somewhere around 10% of that potential effect. There's a simple adjustment that changes that completely. You cut the broccoli first, then leave it sitting for about 40 to 45 minutes before any heat is applied. During that time, that reaction happens ahead of cooking. So the sulforaphane is already formed. Once it's there, it holds up much better through the cooking process. That single step has been shown to increase availability by more than 300%. That matters more as the body gets older. There's a buildup of what are often called senescent cells, cells that have stopped dividing but don't clear out and instead release signals that create a more inflammatory environment around them. Sulforaphane has been linked to helping accelerate the removal of those cells. I've seen this play out in a case like Robert 71, a retired firefighter. His PSA levels had been elevated for several years under observation. After adjusting his diet, including preparing broccoli this way, along with other changes, those levels stabilized and then began to come down over about 14 months. From a practical standpoint, 3 to 4 cups per week fits with what's been observed. And even if the enzyme has been affected by cooking, there's a workaround. Adding a small amount of mustard seed powder afterward reintroduces that enzyme, allowing the reaction to happen again. And then you get to something that doesn't look impressive on the surface, but the consistency in the research around it stands out more than almost anything else. Tomatoes, specifically when they're cooked, and the compound lycopene. When data from over 260,000 men was pooled across multiple studies, higher intake of lycopene lined up with about a 26% lower risk of prostate cancer overall. In the group with the highest intake, that reduction went up to 44% for more aggressive forms. What's interesting here is how cooking changes the picture. Heating tomatoes increases how much lycopene your body can actually absorb by around 55% compared to raw. It's one of the few cases where cooking improves availability rather than reducing it. Inside the body, lycopene has been linked to two things that become more relevant with age. It interacts with IGF-1, a growth signal that tends to stay elevated in many adults, including in ways that support unwanted cell growth. And it's also been shown to help protect mitochondrial DNA from oxidative damage, something that becomes more noticeable as those systems lose efficiency over time. From a practical standpoint, 4 to 5 servings a week is where the research tends to land. A serving would be about half a cup of tomato sauce or a quarter cup of tomato paste. And there's one detail that makes a big difference with this one. Lycopene is fat soluble, so it needs fat to be absorbed properly. When tomatoes are eaten with something like olive oil, absorption increases dramatically, close to 4 times higher than without it. When you step back and look at all 5 of these together, black beans, walnuts, pumpkin and its seeds, broccoli prepared the right way, and cooked tomatoes with fat, they all sit at that intersection between what traditional diets have been doing for a long time and what modern research is now confirming. They're simple, they're accessible, and they don't depend on anything outside of what's already available to you. And one of the more important points here is that changes in this area don't necessarily take years to show up. In many cases, shifts in markers related to immune function or cellular stress have been observed within weeks to months after those patterns are in place. If this is the kind of information that changes how you look at what you eat day to day, subscribe now. And let me know in the comments which one of these you're actually going to start using first and whether anything here changed how you prepare it. That's where these changes begin to show up gradually in ways that only become clear over time.